Welcome. My name is Scott Hammond, and I have the pleasure today of interviewing Mariana Tavares de Araujo. Mariana, let me tell you a little bit about her. She is a graduate from the Catholic University in Rio de Janeiro, and actually a native Carioca. She did her LM in Georgetown before starting a career in public service, where she eventually rose to become the head of the SDE, at the time, one of the three competition authorities in Brazil, and we'll be spending time today talking about your tenure there. Most recently, she left there in 2010 and went on to her current practice at Levy and Salomao, and I know that you're also a consultant for antitrust matters with the World Bank.
That's it.
So welcome.
Thank you.
Mariana, there's a number of things I'm dying to ask you about because during your tenure in Brazil, there were things that the SDE did that were frankly remarkable, not just in terms of the impact that it had on competition enforcement in Brazil, but the fact that you address some timeless issues that competition enforcers deal with all of the time and frankly struggle with, and did them better than any other agency has ever done them. I mean that. One of the things was the way that you were able to recruit and educate and integrate federal prosecutors and state prosecutors in Brazil, as well as the federal and state police, into your cartel enforcement efforts. Now, this is an area that many competition authorities struggle with, because the norm across the world is to have a competition authority that is separate from the prosecutor's office. And while there may be criminal laws on the books in many jurisdictions, it's very difficult to get that kind of partnership developed. And frankly, many jurisdictions don't even try because of the challenges that they face and the fact that most prosecutors, public prosecutors, don't have the resources, don't have the expertise, and frankly don't have the interest. But that hasn't, that may have been the situation when you started as the head of SDE, but it really changed. Can you share with us first why that became a priority of yours at the SDE?
Thank you, Scott. Well, basically because we wanted to have an effective cartel enforcement program, and there wasn't any other way of doing that. There had been, well actually since 2000, there had been some attempts to establish a cartel enforcement program. There were some cases, but Brazil was still focused on merger review. But when in 2003 we established cartel enforcement as a top priority, we knew that we needed help. We needed to integrate that's the word you used, with our criminal counterparts. To have the law criminal statutes was already a big help. So, but we knew we needed to make use of one, their complementary expertise, two, the tools, the investigative tools available, and three, their expertises. And so that was the first thing to do, to get in touch with the prosecutors and convince them to work together with us. As you said, it wasn't always easy. These are people that had no competition background. They had different bosses. Some of them were also responsible for cases, well, many other cases, such as murder cases in some states. But we were relentless about this. We had several meetings with them, and at some point, they started listening. The first meetings were basically theoretical. We were there and said, look, this is as important as investigating and prosecuting a robbery. This is just as stealing consumers. And they started to get it. I think one of the crucial things was that we were particularly helpful on the recruitment stage. We chose very sharp and very committed prosecutors with already what they were doing. So we began this relationship. Then we started building on this relationship. We had already established cartel enforcement as our priority, so we were doing our homework, our homework and going about our cases. But why we did it? First, because, as I said, we needed to make use of their expertise, their investigative tools, and take advantage of the fact that they're all over Brazil. Second, we knew that if we made use of that, we would be able to impose significant sanctions that would effectively deter cartel enforcement. And third, there is one specific issue that relates to Brazil that had to do with our leniency program. It would improve our leniency program, and with that, our chances of having an effective cartel enforcement program.
I want to ask you about that leniency program in a moment because it has been so successful. But going back to how you did it, you talked about targeting specific prosecutors that you knew had a background in white-collar expertise and converting them first. And one of the things that I observed was how you took the recently converted and then you made them disciples. Because I remember going to ICN workshops or even at the OECD where we did a prosecutors workshop, and these newly converted Brazilian prosecutors were taking the lead and also now recruiting and bringing along other prosecutors. Can you talk about how that was accomplished in Brazil? We chose the state prosecutors from São Paulo because it's a very important state, but also because they seemed willing to learn. As I said, we started this conversation with them while we were at home doing our homework. We were choosing some cases that would send out strong messages, and they were paying attention. So we're here talking to them and going and at home doing our homework. At some point, there's another thing that I should mention. We were also doing, we're also engaging in conversation with the federal police, which is a sister agency, which used to be a sister agency of the SD, that was one of the competition agencies at that time. So at some point, I think luck had a role to play too. in one case, we received an anonymous tip that there was a cartel going on in an important sector of the economy. So my predecessor, who was the head of the agency at that time, talked to the head of the federal police and convinced him to appoint an undercover agent to go to that trade association where the cartel participants met and find out what was going on. And this police agent went there, and he several times as an insurance agent. That was his disguise. And he went there for several times. And he came back at some point a bit frustrated that there was nothing really going on. The only thing that he found kind of odd was that just before big procurement, the place went crazy. They had several meetings, and the people were very excited at the trade association. So with that, we went to the court and we got our first search warrant. But when we got that first search warrant with the federal police, we asked the court to appoint the criminal prosecutors from São Paulo as technical assistants. So that was our first raid and our first opportunity to work together with them. Why we chose that case was the reason why we chose that case was that not only it was in São Paulo, but it was also a case that they would get its importance, and third, because we needed their help with that. And that first case was the first time when we actually started working together, building the case together, and we really invested in that relationship. It was their first cartel case, so we needed to help them throughout the investigation, basically explaining what they were looking for. And whenever they called us, we were in Brasilia, and whenever they called us, we went to São Paulo and we met with them. And for this case, they really requested our help a lot. While this case was still ongoing, we got lucky again, and there was this other investigation, and there was a complaint about a cartel in this other sector, also very important, something that they also would get. And in that case, because we needed to make use of wiretapping, it was the perfect case for them to take the lead.
And after that, and at that point they were quite comfortable with that, and they're still very proud of having taken the lead in that case. In parallel to that, we were also investing in what you mentioned that I thought, that I really think it was just as important, is that we were inviting them and funding as well these trips to these international meetings. So the ICN, the OECD, sometimes UNCTAD, and whenever possible, we wanted to get them invited to speak as well, because that would make them have to prepare, do their and then they felt they were being increasingly confident that this was their turf, and they got to meet with you and with other important big players in the international market. And with that, when they came home, they started also to spread the word within Brazil, within their fellow prosecutors. Mm-hmm. And that is so effective. The other thing that was also very helpful was that we started, well, they were spreading the word within their networks. Criminal prosecutors in Brazil joined several, they have their own, several of their networks. Networks on money laundering, network on economic crimes. And they were spreading, while they're spreading the word within these networks, we also got invited to this network to help them spread the word too. So what started in São Paulo then became a template for cooperation between the SDE and the other, at the time, administrative authorities, with state prosecutors, federal prosecutors, and the police all around Brazil. Mm.
It's a lot of great lessons there. I mean, it's the relationships that you built, the investments that you made. I think one of the things that you've told me before was how you had actually invested in developing a forensics lab.
That's right.
To help, that you paid for, the SDE paid for, but for the use of the federal police that they used for your investigations.
That's right. And we started, well, the cooperation, after some point of cooperation, we executed cooperation agreements and started to encourage them to create specialized cartel units. And within these cartel units, one of the inducements that we used was that, okay, we'll help you with a forensic lab. And we weren't doing them any favor. They were doing us a great favor, because they knew they didn't know if at some point they didn't know exactly what a cartel, how a bid rigging worked. They knew how to investigate, and we didn't. So, and they were willing to do the work. The SDE, well, the antitrust agencies, actually, the human resources is an issue, and these investigations can take years. So these specialized units really helped, well, them at the criminal level and the SDE at the administrative level build strong cases, and in an efficient manner too.
Speaking of the forensic lab as an inducement to cooperation, I'm going to come back to leniency. Every jurisdiction that is introducing criminal sanctions, or maybe just dusting off a criminal law that's been in the books for a long time, struggles with the education process with federal prosecutors to get them to buy in to the leniency program, because it is a foreign concept to most prosecutors. And so in many cases, having criminal sanctions could be the greatest incentive to taking advantage of a leniency program. But in some cases, it can become the greatest single disincentive if you don't have a partnership. And obviously, that's where you are today, but I'm sure that process wasn't easy as well. Can you share the lessons that you experienced in terms of getting to the point where you have prosecutors who accept and buy into the importance of the leniency program? And by the way, your situation is much more difficult than many jurisdictions, because you have all these independent prosecutors across the 27 states in Brazil. So share your experience there.
That was, starting to talk to them about cartels was already, trying to convince them to spend their time investigating cartels was already a big challenge. And trying them to buy the leniency concept was, as you said, was a challenge in itself. We started with the first part, and this first part was already ongoing. Remember that we had at that point two cases where we had administrative and criminal investigations ongoing. We were already working together. We were spreading the message out. We, whenever these cases, whenever there was a raid in these cases or the investigation started, we used a lot the press to spread the word. So the other prosecutors were hearing this, reading this in the press and hearing this from their colleagues in São Paulo. So they had already bought into the importance, many of them had already bought into the importance of being effective in prosecuting cartels, and they had already understood that they needed an efficient and effective investigative tools. They also begun to understand that having someone that was willing to self-report and to cooperate would make a huge difference in the process. But again, we were knocking on different doors. So we already had some reputation with these two cases where there are already parallel criminal investigations, and we were looking for opportunities. At some point, we found an opportunity. It might not, it wasn't an easy case because it was a case that was already ongoing. There was this criminal investigation ongoing in one of the south states in Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, on a bid rigging case where the criminal prosecutor was investigating fraud and corruption. And he sort of mentioned this to my predecessor, Daniel, and Daniel convinced, and in that case, he had a whistleblower. So he had an investigation that was where he was investigating based on our procurement statute and in the criminal code, corruption and fraud in procurement, and based on a whistleblower that had self-reported based on another statute. We have a whistleblower statute. And so the trick was to convince the whistleblower to join the leniency program as well. It was the owner of one of the companies that was cooperating. Well, he was individually cooperating with the criminal prosecutors, and then the company and himself were the applicants in this case. So this is how it happened, and then on October 8th, 2003, we had our first leniency case. We made a big fuss about that, and it was very helpful to make the other prosecutors in the 22 states want to hear about it, and they begun understanding that it wasn't just there yet, but they begun understanding that that could take there somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I want to move now to another education process that you were overseeing during your tenure at the SDE. And again, let me just say, because in my experience, I've seen a lot of jurisdictions try to address this issue, including the U.S. Department of Justice, and I've never seen a jurisdiction do it quite as innovatively and creatively and with so much energy as you and your folks did. And what I'm referring to is the education of the public, addressing what sometimes is referred to as the knowledge gap or the information gap. How do we get the message out publicly? How do competition enforcers educate the public, the media, businesses, consumers about the importance of strong competition enforcement? And everybody engages in advocacy and understands the importance of it. But the ideas that you all came up with, I'm going to let you share them, but if you forget any, I'm going to jump in because there are so many good ones. But can you talk about a little bit about your first, just the public campaign, and then I want to talk to you about how you address some of the businesses and procurement groups and some of the other specific groups. But start publicly about some of the ideas and where they came from.
Well, I should begin by saying that Brazil had price controls in place since up to 1994. So these outreach programs, they were also, they were just as needed as enforcement, and it was a fair thing to say because it would surprise you that how that a significant part of the Brazilian population until, well, 2000, well, actually even after 2003, was not aware, including actually some of the important persons were not aware of how bad cartels were. So we needed to do that, but we wanted to do it in a fun way, and we wanted to, and because we knew that simply giving out speeches saying that cartels are bad would not do the trick.
That's all I did for years.
You should have
You're
asked
saying the
me.
money was wasted time.
No, seriously, it's important, but it depends on the audience, and I think that was one of the issues. But so we tried to be creative and to innovate at all times. But it wasn't really everything our idea. We borrowed from what other jurisdictions were doing. We borrowed from what other government agencies were doing, for example, in the health sector or in the, with respect to convincing people to pay their taxes or with respect to environment. And we just put our seasoning on it and also try to come up with new ideas. So you mentioned the national campaigns. Mm-hmm. We did a few of them. We did something at the airports where we published some. We published some booklets. One of the first booklets that we published was on our leniency program. So we did that around the same time where we decided to do this national campaign, and we decided that it would probably be a good idea to do it at airports, so as that because of the influx of people, but outflux of people as well, but also because we would have business people coming in and coming out. But we did that at the same time where we did a campaign in the. But
you didn't just have brochures, hang them out at airports.
No.
No. You had tell us what they were wearing in the airports.
We had, so this was, thank you, this was a big campaign. We had advertisements in the magazines saying, this was 1 year, don't engage in cartels, don't let your company get dirty, don't engage in cartels. And we had some people looking like high-end executives, dirty, in different scenes, depending on the sectors. We had some of these sectors were chosen depending on the number of investigations that we had ongoing.
Construction sector. I remember the guy with oil dripping down
Oil,
his head.
because we had several investigations in the fuel sector. Then we have there were several investigations in the construction sector. So there was someone with sand, and so these were campaigns in the weekly magazines. At the same time, we had all the SDE team and some people from the other agencies, the other competition agencies as well, wearing T-shirts saying, if you want to report a cartel, at the back, ask me how, and giving out these brochures and giving out leaflets that with the same message. If you want to report a cartel, ask us how. And this was, some people found it interesting, but I know that some people were scared about it. It's interesting that just the other day, I was working on a leniency case, and I was interviewing some of the employees, and one of them told me that that the first time he realized he might be in trouble was when he was landing at Guarulhos Airport in São Paulo, and someone handed him the booklet. We also had this big sculpture symbolizing the 8. That was the first leniency agreement was executed on October 8th. So we did something. We had this big sculpture of an 8 actually lying down. It was a nice way of saying that if you lie down the 8, you have like the infinite symbol of the infinite. So it was just to show that this was a program that would last, that was something that was there to stay. So, and then we had the national campaigns and the booklets. This was 1 year. We did something a few years later with the World Cup. there was this, it was called the Fair Playing Campaign. So at that time, the T-shirts were the T-shirts of with the colors of the Brazilian team, so yellow and green, and there was this symbol saying fair play, and we also had actually a stamp. We had our postal service print a stamp of the Fair Playing Campaign, and the campaign that was also out in magazines was of a referee flashing out a red card to some executive that was putting his hand, looking very embarrassed, his hands over his head, looking very embarrassed, and the referee saying, "Fair play, do not engage in cartels." Well, there are several others, but I think the key thing is that we try to make it sexy. We try to really draw people's attention to what the message was, so the message had to be interesting.
No Brazilian could stop but look at a advertisement that has Brazilian soccer in it too. So you took advantage of that.
Yeah, that was actually 2010, and we took advantage of the fact that there was a World Cup ongoing. Yeah. And the reason why we did that was because there was a lot going on in preparation for the World Cup and the Olympics in Brazil as well.
Okay. Another thing you did was a little bit more of a direct approach to businesses by sending out, I think, 1,000 letters to the 1,000 largest companies in Brazil. And what message did you share with them?
Well, we chose, we had a data bank of the main companies that had been investigated at some point, even, regardless of the stage of the investigation, and we chose 1,000 of the most relevant, and we sent letters signed by me and by the head of the competition department at the time, inviting them to come and talk to us if they had anything to say. And we knew it worked because they called their lawyers and their lawyers called us saying, "Why did you send them this message?" I said, "We just wanted to tell them that there's a leniency program, and if there's anything they want to tell us about, we're here to listen." And the number of leniency applications just increased over time. It would be premature. It would be to say that it was just because of that, but it does add to the instability of of any cartel if you surprise them and say, "We're after you." Mm-hmm. So.
And then you took the show on the road a little bit too. I know that you were actually here in Washington and some other places in Brussels, visiting law firms. Can you talk about that effort?
We wanted to play in the big league, and we knew that the decision to apply for leniency was made by law firms in Brussels and law firms here in Washington, D.C., and they wanted them to, and we wanted to tell them, you cannot afford not to pay attention to us. We are coming after your clients in a good way or in a bad way. So you should pay attention to our leniency program. At the same time, we already had some record to show. So there were already criminal investigations ongoing. There were already a significant number of search warrants served. There were already 10 convictions in criminal cases. So we already had a significant record, and we had things to show. At the same time, we wanted to show them that we were willing to listen and to be flexible, that we were that we had a workable leniency program, but that we were willing to sit down and listen to any suggestions that they had to make and to address any issues, institutional issues that made sense. It was, I think it was very effective. Overall, again, the number of leniency applications have only increased over time.
Undoubtedly, it was very effective. You've shared all these initiatives with respect to the national campaign, the advertisements, even a sculpture, that obviously requires enormous support from the administration, and including financial support. And I think it all culminated with the announcement by then President Lula in a National Anti-Cartel Enforcement Day, an event that I had the pleasure of participating in. And I actually remember it as one of the highlights in my career because I get some goosebumps. Can you set the stage for our audience in terms of that day and what it meant to you?
It meant a lot to me. I always get goosebumps when I talk about this day. It was we had convinced our boss at the time, the Minister of Justice, to convince President Lula to establish the date where we had our first leniency agreement as the National Cartel Day. Then that was when we did our first big outreach campaign with the magazine and the airport campaigns. Then we wanted to do something, again, be creative and innovate. So we wanted to do something even bigger. And that was 2009. We were already working together with the prosecutors, with the criminal authorities. We wanted them to be even more engaged. So we organized this big event. We started by organizing this big event where we would gather all the prosecutors, all the state and federal police, and the prosecutors from all the 23 states and the federal prosecutors to discuss to discuss cartel enforcement. Then we decided that we wanted them to actually acknowledge its importance. So we would have, at that day, them sign a declaration that was then named the Brasilia Declaration, where they said that they all committed that they acknowledged that cartels are bad, that they all committed to severely to investigate and to severely punish cartels, and to establish a network where they would cooperate and exchange with the Antitrust Authority their expertises. But we wanted more. We wanted some international stars, such as you, and we also invited former Commissioner Nandy Cruz and the head of the Portuguese Competition Authority, Manuel Sebastião, to this event to talk to these prosecutors. But since we had so great guests, we also wanted more, and so we convinced our boss, who's a great guy, the Minister of Justice. He was actually both Minister of Justice. Since 2003, they were very supportive. We did our homework. We did advocacy at home, and first thing was to convince them that that was important. And we were very good about that. And so they were convinced about that, and then they were doing advocacy to their bosses and to President Lula. So and at that point, what it would mean to say to show that they knew that cartel was important was that they attended that event. That event would be held on October 8th, where we were celebrating the 6th anniversary of the first leniency agreement. And we had that. It was we were doing that while we were organizing the Brasilia Declaration event. So we had this almost as last minute idea. But President Lula was Switzerland for the Olympic Games, FIFA?
He had been in London and had just returning that day.
But where was that? Was it London? Oh, yeah, I think it was London, because Brazil was competing with the U.S. to get the Olympics to take place in Rio. Yeah. The whole government was in London. And so my boss was in London, the Minister Tarso. President Lula was in London too. And so we called the vice president and his assistant, of course, and we said, we're going to have this big event. And President Lula is not here, and the Minister of Justice is not here. but we really we need support to show how the Brazilian government thinks cartels are important. So we can, he said, please send us a memo explaining why that's important. We sent them the memo, the booklets, everything. And he said, I want to come, because he used to be, he was, he used to be head of a big company in the fabric sector. So it was a familiar concept to him. He said, this is important, I want to attend. At the same time, we called the Minister of Justice and we said, we got the Vice President, but are you going to be here? He said, sure, I'm going to be here. But at that point, he said, I think I want to bring President Lula in. And so I said that this would be great. So he talked to President Lula, but at that point we wouldn't want to say to the Vice President, we don't need you anymore. We would let them decide that among themselves. So in the end, we had President Lula, Vice President José Alencar. We had the head of the minister in charge of investigating corrupt practices in Brazil. We had the Minister of Justice. We had we had Nelly Cruz, and we had 200 criminal authorities from all around the world and 300 other people.
And you had all of the Brazilian media in attendance as well.
Yes,
and as well as one of the most renowned cartoonists was also there.
Oh yes, there's that.
And I will tell you that President Lula's speech that he gave that day, he gave prepared remarks for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then he went to off-the-cuff remarks for another 10 minutes or so. And I thought it was one of the most compelling cases for strong cartel enforcement that I've ever heard. And I remember looking over at you and to Ana Paula, and you guys were levitating about 5 feet off your chairs.
I was levitating.
It was fantastic. Okay. Well, I've been monopolizing the time on cartels, and I want to move off there because during your tenure you've done so much more has happened. There's been significant change in merger reform during your time, and since then, can you talk a little bit about that reform and how that came about?
Brazil has had competition law for a number of years, and the statute, just before this statute, had introduced, when effective competition started, had introduced mandatory merger review, but we had a post-merger review and we had 3 competition agencies. We also had very low thresholds. So it didn't work. We had 3 agencies having to stamp over 700 transactions every year, and that simply drained resources that would not allow the agencies to do anything else. We certainly wouldn't have been able to investigate anti-competitive conduct, including cartels, if the SD had continued to issue reports, investigate and issue reports in all merger cases. So we knew that was important. We didn't wait for the law to be approved to begin doing our work in other areas, but we knew we needed to change the system. So we started the discussion about the need to introduce changes to the system in 2000. It took 5 years before the law was sent to Congress, the bill was sent to Congress, and it took additional 3 years for the bill to be treated as a priority by the government. And then finally, 11 years after the bill was, the discussion started, the law was approved in Congress in May 2012, so almost 2 years now, the law came into force. And it has really changed the landscape. We had 3 agencies. That was not efficient. So we have now the SDE and the other agency at the Ministry of Finance, CAI, were folded into one agency, CADE. We have now a new merger review system. Brazil has moved into post-merger to pre-mergers and with sensible thresholds. There are, of course, challenges ahead, particularly with respect to a merger review, but there always is, right?
Yeah. So during this last 2 decades. I mean, you talked earlier about there being price controls as early as the late in the 90s, and looking to where we are today, and where we are today includes the fact that Brazil has had over the last decade one of the most fastest growing economies in the world. I think they've now grown to the 7th largest and most wealthiest economy in the world. What are your thoughts in terms of the role that competition enforcement has had in partnering in that success?
A crucial role. We've had competition laws in Brazil since actually 1938. It wasn't enforced then since 1962, but we had price controls up to mid-90s. But in the mid-90s, when that law, the 1994 statute, came into force, there are other significant regulatory reforms in place, and this changed the landscape. After that, firms actually began competing in the market, and the antitrust authorities have started to promote competition through advocacy, to prevent anti-competitive conduct, and to enforce the antitrust statute in several ways, and to promote, which helped promote growth. To give you an idea where we were in the beginning of the mid-90s, where the first cartel case was initiated. It's actually a funny story. The other competition agency I mentioned at the Ministry of Finance used to be the Price Control Unit. Mm-hmm. That was around until 1994. Then they overnight it became the Competition Agency. So the head of the Competition Agency, 2 years after that, was sitting at his desk, and he has this. And he receives his request for a meeting, and he met with a group of companies in one of the sectors, actually in the these companies asked the meeting to tell him that they had planning to increase prices 2 weeks after that. And he told them, look, don't do that. This now is illegal. So they didn't believe him. They went back, increased the prices, and voila, we had our first cartel case. But this was 1996. With all, and at the other end, there's this other case in 4 or 5 years ago in the what competition can do for consumers. That's a good. That is not a cartel case, but also shows how competition has been good to Brazilian consumers. It is a case where the companies were competing to build a dam. And they had, and actually one of the companies had executed exclusivity agreements with turbine and generators producers in Brazil. And with that, it would have prevented the other companies from participating in the bid. So we initiated this investigation, found that there were no alternative to these other companies to participate in the bid. An injunction was issued, so the other construction companies were able to form consortia with these turbine and generator manufacturers. The result of this, the result of a competitive bid, was an economy of around $2 billion for Brazilian consumers in energy. So that's a lot. So competition has played a significant role, from initiating the first cartel case by enforcing the new statute into this most recent case.
Yeah. Well, opening up a little bit more, looking at Latin America more broadly. I mean, Brazil certainly is a leader in the Latin American cartel area, and cartel enforcement, as well as internationally. But I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts in terms of sort of an assessment of the landscape in Latin America for cartel enforcement, because it's not just that Brazil that's gone through a transformation process. Can you share your thoughts in terms of how you see competition enforcement in Latin America?
Sure. It has changed a lot in the past 20 years. 20 years ago, you had countries 20 years ago, several countries adopted competition laws. Right now, Brazil, together with Colombia, Chile, Mexico, play a prominent role. That was not the case in 20 years ago, where Peru, Argentina, and Venezuela had a more relevant role to play. It's still quite heterogeneous. Just last year, Paraguay adopted its competition law, but it is evolving. Peru, for example, has competition enforcement and cartel enforcement also has picked up in Peru again. So I think this is in some, I think it's still heterogeneous. The landscape has changed a lot in the past 20 years. There are prominent countries such as Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. They're all focusing a lot on cartel enforcement, but competition in general has been on the rise in the past 20 years. And I think the message, the lesson here is that you're never done. You see some countries that fall back and then they're back on the game again, and it just shows that you have to be paying attention and committed to getting it right.
So Brazil now is in this enviable position that I refer to sometimes as a must-see jurisdiction in the cartel area, and by that I mean when multinational companies discover that they've been engaged in international cartel activity, which in some cases involves global, a global scale. They have to make a decision whether to self-report that conduct to authorities. And then they have to make a further decision, if they are going to self-report the conduct, where to report the conduct. And that universe used to be very small not too long ago, with a few jurisdictions, maybe the United States and Canada and the European Union, and then over time, though, it's begun to grow as jurisdictions like Brazil have begun to make a name for themselves and become jurisdictions that these same multinational companies could not ignore. And of course, we've been talking about how you made that so. And so now Brazil is part, as you said, you wanted to, I don't know if you said it exactly, play with in the big leagues, mm-hmm. and made sure that that message was heard loud and clear. And so now it's quite often the case that when a multinational company decides to report in the jurisdictions I mentioned before, they're also going to be knocking on your door. And there are a few other jurisdictions that have achieved that status as well. But then there's a whole host of jurisdictions that would very much like to be on that scale. And so can you talk about what lessons you might share with those jurisdictions to get them over the hump? What do they need to do? What is it that they need to focus on if they want to have that kind of status and stature internationally?
You have to give them a reason to come and talk to you, both because if they don't, there will be consequences for that, but also they have to feel safe by doing that. So we were working on building a record. We had established it as our priority. We were working hard on that, pursuing significant sanctions. There were criminal investigations ongoing, but we're also working on making the leniency program as attractive as possible. So we sat down with international counterparts, not only from other government agencies. You will remember how many times I called you over these years, but also with the business and legal community to hear what they had to say. So we were giving them reasons to come forward. We were trying to make it easy for them to come forward. And we were also trying to make it possible to converge, to encourage convergence and so that we could, for example, as we ended up doing, join a joint raid with the US and with the EU. It was the only way we could do that was because we had some record already, but that we had some. We were working on making the door in a easy way in. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is choose your partners right and invest in that relationship. Domestic partners, as we did with the criminal authorities and with the procurement agents, which we trained together with the OECD in a program on bid rigging. So we kept them, we invested in that relationship with those partners. And the third lesson is, don't think you're ever done. It is a work in progress. You should always be worried about falling back to a place where you don't want to be. So I guess these are the three most important messages.
With the time I have left, I just want to ask you a few more personal questions. First, how did you get into competition enforcement in the first place? What was the genesis for your interest in competition?
I came to DC for an LLM at Georgetown, and I didn't know which courses to take. So I got the list and showed my father the list, and he looked at it and said, "You must take this class." This class was Steve Salop's class. So I registered and I attended his class. I suffered a lot, but in the end, I decided to take another class of his the other semester, and after that, I decided that was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. Haven't regretted since then.
Can you talk about your father? What was his position? What was his employment?
My father is a worked as an economic consultant, and he's also involved with competition and trade matters. So we also talked a lot about these issues, and it spiked my interest. But so yes, I guess it was a combination of these conversations and Steve Salop's classes.
Mm. And what kind of advice would you give to young attorneys or somebody coming out of law school, starting a professional career? What advice do you share with? I'm sure you come across those folks all the time when you are in public sector and in private practice, and what do you share with them?
I think the most important lesson is, of course, you have to be very committed to what you do, but try to get involved with things that you're not required to do. So administrative things, learn how your law firm works, and think about how to improve your business. Try to be a mentor to someone younger than you, and find out how to take more out of your relationship with your mentor. And try to get exposed in ways that you wouldn't normally be exposed at that stage of your career.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure and an honor for me to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Scott.
The impact that you've had, not just in Brazil and not just in Latin America, but internationally, has been tremendous, and it's been a lot of fun to watch as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words. It has certainly been teamwork, and there are several important people before me that did their part of the work as well.
There always is, but you left a legacy behind when you left, and that I know the authority continues to build on. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.